On this week's episode of Things That Matter, Pastor Brian and I talk about sermon prep and 3 books every aspiring preacher should read. Welcome back to Things That Matter. It's great to be with you. My name is Josh Turansky. This is Pastor Brian Brodersen. Each week we address something that's important for you in ministry or in the Christian life. And today we want to talk about preaching prep or preparing a sermon. This is something I'm sure many of the guys out there watching, even gals preparing a Bible study, can relate to. So let's start with just kind of the basics for you as you're thinking about preparing a sermon. What are some of the things you do early on?
Yeah. Well, Josh, that's it's a little bit hard to talk about sermon preparation today versus sermon preparation 20 years ago versus sermon preparation even 35 years ago. Yeah. So my preparation has been different over the years. I think generally the same, but it's kind of morphed from one thing into another over time. I remember reading years and years ago, I think it was G. Campbell Morgan who, before he ever taught through a book of the Bible, he read through it numerous times. I can't remember the number of times, but, maybe like 20 times or something like that. He read through the book. He really sort of just saturated himself in the text. And I remember reading that and just being impressed by that. That I think that is definitely the place to start, because you want to know the text itself just for what it says. And then from that point, you bring in the different helps, maybe some commentaries, maybe some things that commentaries a lot of times will deal with background, depending on the kind of commentary. But, you want some background information. You're going to want to have some information about language, the Greek language, the Hebrew language, and so forth. When I was younger, I remember, setting out to study for a book of the Bible and having a stack of commentaries that was almost as tall as I was. It was just I got every imaginable commentary on the particular book, and tried to make my way through those. And I remember at times being so frustrated and so fatigued, feeling like, man, I've got so far to go, and I just can't get all this information in, and kind of just glutting myself with information. And sometimes that would even make the message even a little more complicated, because I was struggling with, what should I say, shouldn't I say, kind of thing. So over the years, as time's gone on, I began to narrow down the number of resources that I would use in that sense. Now, many decades later, now actually, when I teach through a text, a book of the Bible, I'm looking for 2 to 3 commentaries that I'm going to refer to. Out of the 3, there might be one that will kind of be the one that I will lean on the most. But that's after I've already done my own, reading over the text a number of times, kind of looking at it, kind of breaking it down in my own mind, or maybe, breaking it down with pencil and paper. But then, trying to find that one commentary that's going to be kind of like my companion, through the journey. So a few years ago, I taught through Ephesians. I think a lot of people would notice as they listen to me teach through Ephesians, although I would quote a variety of different people throughout the teaching of the epistle. Stott was probably the one that I would quote most frequently. And out of the 3 or 4 commentaries I had on my desk, that was the one that I felt the most, was connecting the best with me and kind of giving me insights and so forth. So, but there's just those fundamental things. So it starts with the text itself, getting a grasp on the text, bringing in the other things, to assist. Some people ask, well, how long should I take in my preparation? Well, all of that stuff I'm talking about is preparation. But, how long should I take at actually writing out my sermon outline? And that kind of varies, I think, from time to time. It varies from person to person. There are times when I would say on an average for me, it would maybe be something like 8 hours. But then that could sometimes push over to 12 hours. Sometimes it would go back to maybe 4 hours. I've certainly had times when I prepared an outline in 5 minutes, because it's just the moment, God gives you something and you're just boom, boom, you write down your 4 or 5 points and you just get up and you go. So, it kind of differs from person to person. Yeah. Some people, they approach preaching with like a transcript. They kind of write out everything they want to say, and then they just go from the transcript. What's written is what's going to be communicated. Yeah. I've never been able to do that, and it's just not me. It's just not the way I work. So usually, what I'm doing is I'm just coming up with an introductory paragraph, and then I'm anywhere from 3 to 5 points and a conclusion. And, of course, under those 3 to 5 points, you have a number of sub points as well. But that, for me, my sermon notes will consist of anywhere from 1 page of notes to maybe at the most I might have something like 5. And that's usually if I'm going to be doing extensive quotations.
Okay. So when you're preaching about 350 to 400 times a year, or you're preaching, teaching in somewhere or another between church here at Calvary Chapel Costa Mesa or at conferences or teaching at the Bible college setting.
Yeah.
So you're doing this a lot. What are some of the primary things that you're thinking about, 5 minutes before you step onto the stage?
5 minutes before I step onto the stage?
Yeah.
Well, that all depends. Sometimes I'm thinking, Lord, where are we going with this? That happens quite frequently.
Yeah.
Actually, other times I'm thinking, great, can't wait to get up and go for it. There's still a little bit of uncertainty about everything. When you got your message and you're hoping it's going to go a certain direction, but then it's always when you get up to deliver it. Yeah, there's a dynamic there that can change. So honestly, right up to the time that I get up to preach, that's my time to pray. It's my time to really just be asking the Lord to give me the word of wisdom and knowledge and prophecy and those supernatural things that are going to really take what's in my heart and what I've got down on my notes, and they're going to, it's going to convey it to people in a way that's going to be impactful.
How much because you were a pastor in Vista, California, which is a kind of a surf culture close to the coast. Then you go and you plant a church in London, which is not a surf culture. Right. And now you're here at Costa Mesa. Yeah. So how much has the difference, the varied audiences, affected your preparation?
Yeah, and actually Vista, even though it is relatively close to the coast, it is a bit of a rural community. So you had kind of a combination. The two coastal cities there would be Oceanside and Carlsbad. Vista's just behind them. So you had a bit of a surf culture in Vista, but nothing like you did in the other two cities, especially Carlsbad. But so all that to say, the average congregant in Vista was not necessarily a surfer, but probably, it was a family community, a lot of young families and stuff. So, I never thought so much about that back in those days. It was just, you've got your text and you're just making sure you're doing your preparation, and then you're looking for the Spirit, to have the application of it. When I went to London, I did realize that I was in a completely different situation. I was in an entirely different context. I was in one of the, major cities of the world, and I was right smack in the heart of the city, right near the palace and Parliament and all of those places. So, we would occasionally have members of Parliament come to the church, so we had, PhDs and this, that, and the other thing. And, we had a real diverse group of people, not to mention the fact that we had quite an international congregation as well. So I definitely had to think a little bit differently than I did. I would say in Vista, I just was part of the culture, lived in the culture, never thought much about it because I was in it.
Right.
So what my experience was probably the experience of most people out there. London was a totally different story because these people are, there's so much diversity here. So yeah, I had to think a bit more and be a bit more intentional, in where I'm going and what I'm saying, and sometimes what I'm not saying, because I might say something in that other context that I would not have said.
Yeah. So you had mentioned a minute ago the commentaries, the resources. You mentioned in passing about pen and pencil. So what does it literally look like? What mediums are you using? Are you typing out stuff on a computer for your notes? Are you handwriting stuff?
Yeah.
Are you using ebooks, Bible software?
Yeah. I do not use any Bible software. Not because I think it's bad. It's just because I have not taken the time, to really get used to any particular Bible software. So when I'm using any online type of tools, I'm using Blue Letter Bible, which kind of does for me what I'm looking for. I'm looking for background on words. I'm looking for something that you might find in a Bible dictionary or encyclopedia or something like that. So so that works fine for me. But I do kind of start with pencil and paper. I mean, I kind of try. I've got a little notebook that I try to lay out my main thoughts there, break it down, my points, whatever they might be, and then before I'm finished, I'm going to transfer all that to a Word document, and I'm going to put it on my iPad because I preach from an iPad actually. So so I make that transition, but I do start with a pencil and paper.
Yeah.
Or a pen and paper.
So you talked about how the Brian of today versus 20 years ago, 35 years ago, is really different. So what would the Brian of today tell the 35 years ago Brian about the efforts he's putting in? And
I would say you do not need 15 commentaries on a book. Narrow it down to, when you're young, maybe 5 if but you're gonna kind of come down. Pick good commentators. Get recommendations from other people that have been teaching longer than you. When I was a young pastor in training, I had the wonderful blessing of Pastor Chuck Smith giving me an entire library. So I just he came one day with a bunch of boxes and said, "Here, these are for you." And
wow.
So a bunch of great commentaries. So I had kind of the pick of the litter, as they say there. But yeah, you want to get good material, and I look back and I think in some ways, I'm probably glad that I waded through a lot of that stuff back then, because there's stuff that I will draw on today from 35 years ago, and.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you was, so because you've taught through the Bible multiple times, so how much does coming back to a text you've already taught help in preparing that sermon again or that text again?
Yeah, it helps for sure. And nowadays, depending, I do the through the Bible thing. So as I go through the Bible, the Genesis to Revelation study, that I'm doing not an overview, because that would be more lighter and more brief than what I'm doing. I'm doing a little more in depth than an overview, but I'm not really leaning too much on any commentaries for this. I'm leaning on past experience and things that I've learned over the years, and just kind of putting stuff together. And I might even pull a current quote out of something that relates, like, oh yeah, this fits perfectly in here. Sunday's preaching is different. Sunday is I'm preaching expositorily. I'm going through books of the New Testament, and I'm framing sermons that are 1, 2, 3. Like I said, 3-point, 5-point sermons. Could be longer, could be shorter. So the preparation for that is definitely a bit different. And I've intentionally. Since becoming the senior pastor of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, I have intentionally not used any of my past stuff for my present preaching. So I just have kind of left the past back there, like, okay, because I've got notes, from many of the books that I've taught.
On your computer.
Many of the series that I've done over the years.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I taught through Ephesians, I mentioned Ephesians earlier. When I taught through Ephesians, I just thought, I'm not going to refer to my old notes.
Why?
I wanted it to be fresh, entirely fresh. I just thought, I want something that's just for now. I want the Lord to be impressing on me. And the commentaries I chose, I actually chose a couple of ones that I had not previously used as well.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Interesting.
Now, one thing I would say in closing on the subject of preaching, there are a couple of classic books on preaching that I would recommend every preacher read, not because you're going to walk away and go, wow, okay, now I know how to preach, or wow, I need to give up preaching because I'm never going to be able to do this, but just because they're helpful. And the first one would be Lloyd Jones's classic book, Preachers and Preaching. Just a fantastic book. For anybody who wants to preach, I think that reading that book is excellent. It's a series of lectures that he did. I think he did them at Westminster Seminary in maybe the 70s. Then John Stott had another book. It used to be called Between Two Worlds, but I think the name might have changed more recently. But that's an excellent book on preaching as well. And Lloyd Jones and Stott are considerably different. Lloyd Jones was, of course, he was kind of like a modern Puritan, and he was very much, sort of a little bit detached from emphasizing the cultural situation and all of that. Stott was almost the opposite. Stott wanted to incorporate all kinds of, culture, stuff from theater and modern music and, just the different things happening today. And but it's a great book as well. And then the most recent book on preaching that I've seen that I did enjoy was Timothy Keller's book on preaching.
Yeah.
So I would recommend those three. And anybody who wants to preach, just read through those books, and I guarantee you will be enriched. And at the end of Lloyd Jones's book, he basically says, having said everything he says, now, actually, every one of you are going to have to figure out on your own what works best for you. So I really appreciated that, because he lays out this whole theology of preaching, but then in the end he says, this is something that there's an individual component to it that you're just going to have to work through and develop, because you got to be who you are. Don't try to be somebody else. So
great. Awesome.
That stuck with me.
Great points. Well, we appreciate you tuning in to Things That Matter. Again, we'd love to hear from you. In fact, let's put a question out there to you as the audience. If you're watching this on Facebook or on Twitter or YouTube, leave a comment. Let us know, how long do you spend on a weekly basis to prepare for a sermon? We'd love to hear that feedback from you. And send us your questions so we can respond on air. We'd love to respond back to questions that you might have. Thanks for sharing this episode with your friends and family. And check out the podcast as well on your favorite podcasting app. Thanks for tuning in. God bless.